Palestinian question. The question of Palestine is one of the main problems remaining from the collapse of the Ottoman Empire. We can talk about 5 phases. 1. British Mandate, 1920 to 1948. 2. Establishment of State of Israel and the deepening of the occupation, 1948 to 1987. 3. The resistance of Palestinian people with the start of the Intifada, 1987. 4. Fall of the Soviet Union and the decade of peace process, 1991 to 2000, and 5. Finally, reoccupation of Palestine, Al-Aqsa Intifada, and unilateralism, 2000 and beyond. Palestinian question. The first phase is the British Mandate era, when Israel did not exist, and Britain ruled Palestine. Between 1918 to 1948, Britain controlled the area and tried to keep a balance between Arabs and Jews. Jewish illegal immigration to Palestine was organized by secret organizations and angered Arabs. Revolts and protests took place from time to time. The most important one was the Arab Revolt in 1936. The second phase started after the British withdrawal and declaration of independence of Israel. Israel started occupying Arab territory and forced many Arabs to leave their homes and villages. The third phase was after the Six-Day War, when Israel quadrupled its territory by controlling territories of Egypt, Jordan, Syria, and Jerusalem. The occupation of Palestine deepened, and the refugee issue became worse. Israel started building settlements on occupied territory and sped up with the Judaization of Jerusalem. Another turning point was the breaking out of the Intifada in 1987. Popular uprising forced Israel to review its position, and protests changed all the dynamics. After the end of the Cold War in 1990, the Palestinian issue entered its fourth stage. This was the peace process that lasted almost a decade with no solution in the end. The final phase is the collapse of the peace negotiations and the rule of unilateralism. Israel's unilateral security measures were matched by the Palestinians' unilateral bid for independence. The 4 main final status issues which have been the subject of negotiations between Israelis and Palestinians and their legal bases according to international law. Final status talks are borders, the situation of Jewish settlements, the status of Jerusalem, and the return of refugees. Borders: Palestinians want full Palestinian sovereignty over the whole West Bank and Gaza according to 67 lines. During the negotiations they accepted Israel's right to exist on 78% of historic Palestine, and establishment of a Palestinian state on the remaining 22% of it. Israel believes that withdrawal to the 1967 borders would cause security problems for her and wants to make changes and control more territory in the West Bank. The second issue is the refugees' right to return. According to the UN, around 5 million Palestinians have been registered as the refugees. Palestinians demand full implementation of the right of return. Israel believes that accepting this would trigger an influx of Palestinians, meaning the end of Israel as a Jewish state, since it would change the demography. The third final status issue is the status of Jewish settlements. According to Israeli Interior Ministry, some 448,000 Israeli citizens lived in the 121 settlements. Also, around 375,000 Israeli citizens are the residents of settlements in East Jerusalem. The international community considers settlements not proper from the legal point of view. UNSC Resolution 446 in 1979 calls upon Israel to desist from transferring its population into the territories or changing their demographic makeup. Palestinians want all settlements to be removed from their territory. The fourth issue is the status of Jerusalem. Palestinians demand full sovereignty over East Jerusalem and Haram al-Sharif. Israel wants to keep the city as its eternal and undivided capital. Israel also wants to annex settlements in the West Bank. The meaning of the two-state solution formula and its possibility to be realized. Two-state solution is the internationally recognized solution formula to Palestinian question. It is based on UNGA Resolution 181-2, which envisioned 2 states in Palestine, one Jewish and one Arab, in 1947. According to international decisions and rules, Palestinians expect to have their state on 67 lines and include East Jerusalem. Despite the deteriorating situation on the ground, the U.S. governments until Donald J. Trump continued to support the two-state solution. After Bush, the U.S. President Obama reiterated the support of his country to the goal of two states, Israel and Palestine, living next to each other. On January 28, 2020, U.S. President Trump revealed his plan, officially titled Peace to Prosperity. A vision to improve the lives of the Palestinian and Israeli people, and retracted American support for a two-state solution. Some circles in Palestine also discuss different alternatives like one-state solution, meaning a common Palestinian-Israeli state on the same territory. The logic of Turkey's Palestine policy and understand its historical, social, and political background. Turkey, which has stronger historical cultural ties with Palestinian territories, is interested in Palestinian question for many reasons. In the beginning, Turkey's involvement in the Israeli-Palestinian question was much more related to its relations with the West and the Arab world. The issue was much more a humanitarian problem for a highly secularized state during the Cold War years. Throughout the 1960s, Turkey avoided taking any action which could be regarded as a deviation from its pro-Western-oriented foreign policy in the region. Turkey wanted to develop its relations with the Arab world, but it also tried to preserve a balance with Israel, thus the West. In 1990s, Turkey's policy was supporting negotiations, developing relations with Israel, and protecting Palestinians' legitimate rights and supporting their struggle over Jerusalem. Turkey's relations with Israel was based on collective security needs. After the Al-Aqsa Intifada broke out, Turkey's priority was to prevent the dire humanitarian situation in Palestine and stopping the violence against civilians. Turkey pursued a policy to stop aggression since it would have more significant consequences for the whole region. Turkey also opposed Israel's Judaization of Jerusalem and worked to protect the Muslim identity of the holy places and the protection of Christian sites. Israel occupied Palestine through a combination of violence, war, immigration, and diplomacy. The idea of returning to Holy Land became a political goal of the Zionists. They were able to gather support from Great Britain and used every opportunity to change the demography in Palestine. They forced Palestinians to flee, and they used violent methods to empty villages and towns. Israeli forces also used Arab-Israeli wars to enlarge the territory they controlled. The 1948 and 1967 wars were critical, and Israel exceeded the borders defined by the United Nations. 1967 War or Six-Day War worsened the problem of Palestinian refugees. After the occupation of the West Bank and other Palestinian territories, around 300,000 more people fled, hundreds of villages were destroyed. Refugees spread to different Arab countries like Jordan, Lebanon, Kuwait, Syria, and Iraq. The Six-Day War became a turning point for Palestine, as well as the rest of the Arab world. Gamal Abdel Nasser and his version of Pan-Arabism lost its strength. Palestinians understood that they could only liberate Palestine by themselves. PLO became the sole representative of the Palestinians. Fatah leader Yasser Arafat became the leader of the PLO, and he was recognized as the legitimate leader of Palestinians. Final status talks are related to the borders, the situation of Jewish settlements, the status of Jerusalem, and the return of refugees. The negotiations between Palestinians and Israel were based on the Land for Peace principle and related UN resolutions. UNGA Resolution 181-2, 1947, was regarded as the basis of a two-state solution since it accepted two states in Palestine, one Jewish and one Arab. UN Security Council Resolutions 242, 1967, and 338, 1973, which were accepted following the 1967 and 1973 wars, also served as the basis for an independent Palestinian state on 67 borders. Palestinians had already accepted these decisions in their Declaration of Independence in Algeria in 1988. Another UN decision, UNGA Resolution 194, 1948, recalling the right of return of the refugees also served as the basis of Palestinian claims. On Israeli settlements, the UN accepted several resolutions. UNSCRES 446, 1979, was one of the most important, which said settlements were illegal and against the Fourth Geneva Convention. The UN also took many decisions to protect the status of Jerusalem, like UNGA 2253, 1967, or UNSCRES 476, which did not recognize Israeli annexation of the city. Unilateralism in Israeli-Palestinian conflict. After Camp David talks failed and Al-Aqsa Intifada began, Israeli leaders concluded that they could not get what they wanted via the negotiations. Therefore, Israel focused on taking unilateral security steps rather than seeking a negotiated solution. The continuation of building new settlements, the construction of the walls surrounding Palestinian territory, and the determination of borders by changing facts on the ground were the steps taken by Israel to determine the final status unilaterally. After years of talks, Palestinian leadership also decided to act unilaterally and declared the statehood. Palestinian President Mahmoud Abbas applied to the General Assembly to be accepted as a non-member observer state in the UN. Israel's military operation further strengthened Palestinian unilateralism in Gaza in October 2012. Operation Pillar of Cloud in November 2012, increased tension and the anti-Israeli feeling in the world. On November 27, 2012, at the 65th anniversary of the UN partition plan establishing a Jewish and an Arab state in Palestine in 1947, the Palestinian Declaration of Independence was voted on at the UN General Assembly. The 193-nation Assembly approved Resolution 67/19, which recognized Palestine as an independent state with observer status in the UN. In short, unilateralism means a lack of negotiations and one-sided steps taken by the parties. After independence, Turkey decided to align with the Western world, and the nature of the young republic was highly secularized. This was reflected in its foreign policy with limited contact with the Arab states and distance from the Middle East. In the 1960s, Turkey acted with the Western powers in the Middle East and tried to make friends with the Arab nations while trying to preserve a balance with Israel. This policy changed in the late 1960s after the Cyprus crisis. Turkey realized that she needed support from fellow Arab and Muslim countries and engaged with them more. Furthermore, despite its highly secularized administration, in 1969, Turkey attended the Islamic Conference meetings after the Israel-led sabotage in Al-Aqsa Mosque. Turkey became more active in supporting the Palestinian cause and began supporting the Palestinian Liberation Organization, PLO, in international forums. In July 1980, when Israel decided to move its capital from Tel Aviv to Jerusalem, Turkey downgraded its diplomatic representation in Israel to the second secretary level. On November 15, 1988, when the PLO declared an independent state in exile accepting all the UN resolutions mentioning Israel's right to exist, Turkey was the fifth country in the world and the first NATO member to recognize it. The founder of the Zionist movement is Theodor Herzl. The term that Palestinians use to refer Israel's Independence Day is al-Nakba. The territories Israel occupied in the Six-Day War: Golan Heights, Gaza, Sinai Peninsula, the West Bank. At the end of the Israeli invasion of Lebanon in 1982, PLO leadership was sent to exile to Tunisia. The final status issues in Israeli-Palestinian peace talks: Jewish settlements, status of Jerusalem, borders, refugees. Sharon's visit to Haram al-Sharif was the incident that triggered Al-Aqsa Intifada. The internationally recognized solution formula for the Israeli-Palestinian question is two-state solution. Donald J. Trump damaged the pillars of a possible peace deal by moving his country's embassy from Tel Aviv to Jerusalem. Turkish-Israeli tension became public when Turkish Prime Minister burst out Israeli president in Davos Economic Summit. The name of the flagship of Gaza Aid Flotilla, which raided by Israeli soldiers, was Mavi Marmara. Zionism, the Jewish nationalist movement organized in Eastern and Central Europe in late 19th century, that has had as its goal the creation and support of a Jewish national state in Palestine, which is claimed to be the ancient homeland of the Jews. UN Partition Plan, based on UN General Assembly Resolution 181-2, 1947, a framework for resolving the Israeli-Palestinian conflict by establishing two states, one Arab and one Jewish. Al-Nakba. The foundation of Israel on May 15, 1948 is Al-Nakba, i.e., the catastrophe for Palestinians. The Arab armies, poorly led and equipped, were defeated. The armistice negotiations did not occur until January 1949, by which time between 700,000 and 800,000 Palestinians had fled their homes or been forced to Palestinians fled their villages after hearing news of the massacre by Israeli forces in the village of Deir Yassin. The Palestinians who arrived as refugees in Lebanon, Transjordan, Syria, Egypt, and the Gaza Strip quickly realized that they had lost their homes and would not be allowed to return to them. The Palestinian community refers to this period in their history as Al-Nakba, the catastrophe. Each year Palestinians remember the day as the catastrophe of their nation and mourn. Palestinian Liberation Organization, PLO. Formed by Arab governments to control the Palestinian issue in their hand, PLO was transformed into an umbrella organization for the different Palestinian resistance organizations, but dominated by Fatah. After the Six-Day War, it came into prominence and became sole representative under the leadership of Yasser Arafat. Arab Peace Plan, 2002. In 2002, there was another international attempt in order to bring the sides back to the negotiating table by Saudi Crown Prince Abdullah. In February, he floated the idea of full normalization of relations with Israel in return for withdrawal to 1967 borders. The Arab League accepted this idea on March 27, 2002 in the Beirut summit. In the Beirut Declaration, the League requested Israel to reconsider its policies and called full Israeli withdrawal from all the territories occupied since 1967, including the Syrian Golan Heights, to the June 4, 1967 lines as well as the remaining occupied Lebanese territories in the south of Lebanon. Achievement of a just solution to the Palestinian refugee problem to be agreed upon in accordance with UN General Assembly Resolution 194. The acceptance of the establishment of a sovereign independent Palestinian state on the Palestinian territories occupied since June 4, 1967 in the West Bank and Gaza Strip, with East Jerusalem as its capital.